Hi there, I'm Adam Radwanski. I write about climate policy for the Globe, and I'm here at the Globe headquarters in Toronto, which is exciting for me. I haven't been in here very often in the last year and a half, but I'm here for what I think is a pretty timely convergence. We are heading into the home stretch almost of a federal election campaign. We've got less than 2 weeks to election day. We've got a pair of debates nationally this week. So it's a great time to check in right now to see what we've been hearing in this campaign on climate, and also what we'd like to be hearing, we haven't been hearing enough about. And I'm pairing up today or this evening, depending where you are, with Emma Gilchrist from the Narwhal. Emma, hi, how are you? Where are you? How are things?
Hi, great to see you.
Likewise.
It's great to meet you today for the very first time. Yeah, I'm thrilled to be here. I'm speaking to you today from Victoria, which is on the traditional territory of the Lekwungen speaking peoples, and where the Songhees, the Esquimalt, and Wasanic peoples' relationship with the land continues to this day. And yeah, the Narwhal is really excited to be doing this event with the Globe and Mail. We're a 3-year-old online magazine, and we're focused on doing in-depth and investigative reporting on Canada's natural world. So this is a match made in heaven for us.
Yeah, likewise, this is really exciting, and it's the first time we've done this, and hopefully the start of many such things. So let's start off here by just chatting a bit. I think we're going to get into shortly a whole bunch of topics that we want to cover, at least 5 that we would like to see covered more. What do you make of the campaign so far? What's been your have you been pleased from a climate perspective? Have you been disappointed? And I guess how does this compare for you to what we saw a couple of years ago? And it hasn't been long since the last campaign. What's changed since then?
Yeah, I'm really excited to talk about what has changed since the last election, because I think a lot has changed. But first, I'm just going to tell people that there is closed captioning if they want to turn it on. I forgot to go through all my housekeeping notes there, but there's a button at the bottom there if you want to turn on your closed captioning. We'll also be dropping some links in the chat for newsletter signups for the Globe's climate newsletter and the Narwhal's newsletter. So you'll see those there. And if you have any questions, yeah, please pop them in the chat. We'll be monitoring that. We're going to be working your questions in as we go, and then we'll make sure that we have some time for some at the end as well. But yeah, so what's different about this campaign than the campaign just a short 2 years ago? I mean, the most notable thing is that this is kind of the first time ever that all of the federal parties in Canada have had, or all the major federal parties at least have had, a climate plan, a fully thought through climate plan. By all accounts, most experts are saying there's, several credible climate plans on the table here. That wasn't really what we saw in the 2019 election. The Conservatives kind of had a plan to not do a whole lot. And now they have a lot of different proposals on the table. So that's a really marked difference. We just had the latest report from the International Panel on Climate Change a few weeks ago that talked about a code red for humanity. That against the backdrop of absolutely catastrophic climate change impacts across Canada this summer. I think we felt those especially deeply out in British Columbia with forest fires, heat wave that experts were able to say basically wouldn't have happened without the impacts of climate change. Here in Victoria, we broke our temperature record by like 9 degrees. It's never supposed to be 40 degrees here. Shellfish on the coast all just basically boiled to death on the rocks that day. So, I think climate change is really hitting home in people's brains in a new way right now, coming off such a hot, dry, fiery summer. And so, yeah, we're seeing it really play out in the campaign in an interesting way. At the same time, we aren't really seeing the federal parties talking about it that much in the campaign, because of course we haven't had this other large crisis right now, the pandemic. What are you thinking about the campaign so far, Adam? Like, how do you see it playing out differently than last time?
Yeah, it's similar. I mean, I think so much has changed since last time. And again, yeah, we've seen both the dire warnings about how severe climate change, what severe climate change we're facing. We've seen very tangible impacts, more out west than maybe where I am, but I think no Canadian can ignore that. We're also creeping, closer to 2030, when, depending which party is elected, there's commitments of varying degrees of ambition, but all of them reasonably ambitious compared to what we've gotten so far on emissions reduction. So, all of that sets the stage for a campaign where this is front and center. And if you look at the platforms, you would think it is. At the same time, I mean, both the pandemic, but also we've spent the last so much of this campaign so far has been on other stuff that seems to me less new or less urgent. We've got, I mean, obviously the pandemic protests recently have complicated matters, or the increasingly volatile protests around Justin Trudeau in particular. But also, we were winding up with a campaign where we're talking again a lot about things we hear about every campaign: gun control, abortion, two-tier healthcare warnings. I mean, all of that stuff, which I'm not discounting any concerns about that, but you would hope that climate would be a little more front and center. Having said that, I mean, when you look at these platforms, particularly the Liberals and Conservatives, I mean, the Liberals we can debate their record and we can discuss the, how much trust we have in them to follow through. But the platform is certainly, on the climate side, very comprehensive and ambitious, certainly more so than the reasonably ambitious climate platform they had 2 years ago. And then when you look at the Conservatives, it's not as ambitious as the Liberals, but it's a huge leap forward from where they were before. So clearly the bar has moved a lot, and that's a positive. I think there's maybe a bit of valid concern about how much they're going to be pushed from the other two parties to their left, or if you have to oversimplify. I think the NDP platform has been criticized a fair amount in the last couple of days. There's been or last few days, there's been a fair amount of sort of academic criticism and economist criticism directed toward it, which I think is fairly warranted. Actually, it's ambitious, but not nearly as specific in its commitments as those other two parties, which I think impedes their ability to press. And the Green Party obviously has been having a lot of internal problems that has affected. I mean, put it on a platform hours ago, which I can't honestly claim to have read in its entirety yet, but has maybe been impeded in its ability to kind of push on these issues. But that being said, yeah, we're moving not badly. Are there any particular, looking through the platforms, are there any things that have jumped out at you, or is there anything from each party that's jumped at you as a positive, surprising, new kind of climate proposal you haven't heard before?
Yeah, I mean, there's quite a lot of interesting things in there. In the NDP platform, they have the net zero electricity by 2030 commitment. Their platform is quite vague, but on that point, they're quite clear. So that's quite an interesting commitment. In the Conservative platform, I'd say the thing that I was most impressed with was their commitment around creating protected areas and working towards nature-based climate solutions, which is basically acknowledging the role of protecting our forests and wetlands and grasslands because they store huge amounts of carbon. Even the Conservatives speak to the importance of Indigenous-led protected areas, for instance. So, and they, in fact, that section of the Conservatives platform, they're very specific. They spoke about putting $3 billion towards nature-based climate solutions, which I thought was really interesting to see. And they also spoke to sort of the complications of having these big protected area goals, and that it can be very easy to create these huge protected areas in very far off places. And they spoke about the importance of prioritizing endangered ecosystems. So I was, really, really impressed with that part of their platform. And then for the Liberals, I think what's new there is the detail that they put in place about how they would meet their increased ambition on the climate target. So, in the last 6 months or so, they increased the target from 30% to a 40 to 45% reduction in emissions by 2030. And, they've now put in place the mechanisms by which they mean to do that, including caps on the oil and gas sector emissions in particular, which was kind of a major missing piece before. What about for you, Adam? What has really jumped out at you from the platform so far?
Yeah, I think I criticized the NDP a moment ago. So to start with them on a positive note, although I don't think this is totally new from them, but they include in their platform a commitment to carbon budgets, which means setting for specific time periods, not just sort of a target of by 2030 we'll reduce national emissions by X, but over a period of time, here are the emissions that can come from each sector. And I think that's important because for two reasons. One, it tells us where these reductions are supposed to come from and sets expectations. And two, it ensures that we're not just backloading all these commitments when we really are up against it in terms of reducing emissions. It prevents us from all that happening in 2028 or 29. So that's something that was missing from the Liberal government's climate accountability legislation that I think is positive that the NDP is proposing. On the Conservative side, Their retrofit, they have a bunch of things that are quite detailed, but their retrofit, building retrofit and home retrofit agenda there is quite detailed, probably the most detailed of the parties. And it gets beyond just sort of providing subsidies and grants and into really building a sector that can make homes more energy efficient and all kinds of stuff that, I mean, frankly, looks somewhat lifted from reports by NGOs in this space, but credit to them, it's more detailed than the other parties have. The Liberals, as I said, I mean, I was impressed by the comprehensiveness generally, and there's a lot more numbers in there than otherwise. I think in terms of a new commitment, we might talk a bit more about this, but they've promised a so-called ZEV mandate, requiring a certain number of vehicles to be zero emissions, which I know in BC already exists, but they've set it at 50% of new sales in 2030. That's very ambitious. The Conservatives have 30%, which is also pretty ambitious, and in fairness, made their proposal first. But that's a pretty big, ambitious step, and something where they had previously not been willing to do that because of strong pressure from the auto sector, suggesting that would be a problem competitively or for consumers. And there's a clear decision there by both those parties, really, but the Liberals in a particularly ambitious way that, we really need to accelerate how quickly we get EVs on the road. So I think that's a positive as well.
Yeah, totally. And I think, just to give the Greens like one shout out, they have I also haven't had a chance to review this platform that came out in the last hour or two, but, they have the highest climate ambition of all of the parties, of course, 60% reduction by 2030. But so far, we haven't been able to analyze the details of how they would get there. They also say that they'd scrap the Trans Mountain Pipeline. And they're the only party that really touches on the subject of fracking or hydraulic fracturing, which is a somewhat controversial technique used to access natural gas that's stuck in the rock, and it can lead to contaminated water and earthquakes. So that's interesting things in that platform. It might be good should we pivot to some of the things in these platforms that maybe aren't that great?
Yes. Before we get there, I'll just quickly go over. You mentioned the 60% for the Greens. I guess we should quickly say what each party is targeting there. And I don't know if you have any thoughts on this, but just for those who don't have a scorecard on this, the Greens are at the top end. This sort of goes in sequential order here. The Greens are at 60% of emissions reductions from 2005 levels by 2030. The NDP is at 50% by 2030. The Liberals say 40% plus by 2030, and the Conservatives say 30%. We can discuss how I think we might come back before we finish to how realistic those are, but there we go. So yeah, let's start. We're going to go to these few topics. I think we're going to do 5 of them, and we'll kind of take turns a bit here on what we think is missing, or there could be more of. And Emma, I'll go to you first. I know that you want to talk a bit about nature-based solutions and opportunities for leadership there, including on the Indigenous leadership on that side. This is something obviously the Narwhal covers extensively. What do you make of, first of all, why do you see leadership opportunities for Canada there to maybe both reduce our emissions but and protect our environment, but maybe show the world leadership? And what are you seeing from the parties in terms of what they're promising this campaign?
Yeah, so I mean, by way of context, a few years ago, a study came out in a major academic journal looking at the role for nature-based climate solutions, and found that they could actually fulfill up to 30% of the emissions reductions that we're going to need by 2030. And so when we say nature-based climate solutions, we're talking about wetlands, forests, peatlands, grasslands, and farmlands. Those are the key ecosystems. And Canada has a really unique role to play around nature-based climate solutions because we have 30% of the world's wetlands and boreal forests, for instance. So we have vast amounts of these landscapes, and many of them are unprotected, and many of them are under development pressure. So, we're looking at how do you restore and conserve those landscapes. And, this is a relatively new conversation over the last few years. And so that's why I think it's really interesting to see it come up in all the federal platforms the way that it has. And, I think it's notable too that it is receiving support from across the political spectrum. And I think that's because they are really such win-win solutions, because you look at, protecting a wetland, for instance. Not only does a wetland store a tremendous amount of carbon and is important to birds and ecosystems, wetlands play a crucial role in flood mitigation, for instance. And then another really interesting kind of aspect of nature-based climate solutions is how the the whole concept of Indigenous protected and conserved areas can play into nature-based climate solutions and also play, you know, a really crucial role in advancing reconciliation. So, you know, many Indigenous peoples across Canada have a different vision for what should happen on their land that involves, you know, setting it aside, conserving it, having Indigenous guardians monitoring the land. And by actually, you know, being able to look at the value of that land in a different way, recognizing that it's storing a huge amount of carbon, it helps provide pathways to us actually protecting some of those places. And so, yeah, as I said earlier, the Conservative platform is actually the most specific on this. They talk about dedicating $3 billion towards nature-based climate solutions. They also talk quite specifically to things for farmers and agricultural sectors in terms of looking at, you know, low-till farming, how you apply fertilizers, protecting grasslands and wetlands, those types of things. But the Liberals have already been doing quite a lot on this front as well, and they basically promised to keep doing that. And the NDP also, all three of the kind of main parties there speak about the importance of Indigenous protected areas within those plans. So that's, you know, I think been really good to see that there's commitments to that across the board.
I feel like this is an issue where, and I don't want to say that nobody here thinks about this, but I do feel like it is more top of mind in British Columbia or some parts of the country than it is in others. And I wonder how you, as you said, the platforms do have a decent amount on this. I don't know that we're hearing as much about it. Maybe it's just the lens that I'm looking through. But how do we get more Canadians sort of thinking about this as a matter of pride in it? Is that and a sort of a narrative in this campaign? I mean, are there particular things you would highlight as exciting opportunities here that you see there where you think we can maybe elevate this a bit compared to some of the other stuff that we talk about on the climate side?
Totally. I mean, I think that's such a good question. And I think, you know, people always connect with like specific places and specific examples. And, you know, I think there's really cool examples. We did a series over the last year looking at these, you know, different examples of these landscapes. You know, in Eastern Canada, there's a forest called the Acadian Forest that's, you know, basically thousands of private woodlot owners have a stake in this forest. And there have been some pilot programs there working to create carbon offset programs so that these private woodlot owners who don't really want to cut down the trees on their land have an option to create income through other means. And so I think, you know, there are these little kind of green sprouts of exciting ideas that are coming up. And then, you know, you have several large new Indigenous protected areas, especially in the north over the last few years, like Faidenenene in the Northwest Territories, which really is just, you know, an incredible example of allowing, you know, for Indigenous leadership to protect land, to get Indigenous guardians out on the land, and also building a tourism economy in these places. So I think, you know, from a solutions perspective, they're really interesting. And yeah, we're certainly not hearing about them enough. But I think, you know, the fact that there is support across the political spectrum for nature-based climate solutions hopefully means that we'll be hearing much more about them in the future.
Last thing I'll ask you on this subject before we move on to the next one. You mentioned Indigenous leadership a few times there. How has the federal government done at engaging Indigenous populations and leadership on this? I mean, if we go back a couple of years, which seems like 5 decades ago, but before the pandemic started, right before it, what was dominating the headlines was protests around pipelines and around new projects and blockades and all that. And I don't want to at all dismiss that or the concerns there, but there are probably also some more positive examples in terms of engagement, but I don't know if there are enough. I mean, have you noticed, and in your reporting, have you seen enough engagement from Ottawa? Is there more that it should be doing, or that jumps out at you that the next government could be doing? Yeah,
I think, you know, I think there's a huge amount of interest in Indigenous protected areas that's coming from the Indigenous communities first and foremost. And it's kind of a way out of some of these endless resource battles in the sense that Indigenous communities put forward a proactive vision of what they want to happen on their land, where resource development might be acceptable and where it's not. And so I think we've seen a mix. You know, there have been examples of where the federal and provincial governments have engaged with Indigenous peoples around those protected areas. There's certainly lots of examples of where they've really dragged their heels though too. So I think, we definitely need to see more there. And, a lot of it comes down to money, right? Of how much money are we actually going to put into supporting creating those areas, supporting creating those Indigenous Guardians programs. And so, that will be interesting to see. So pivoting to the next subject, this is something that you cover a lot at the Globe and that you recently had a big feature on in the weekend paper, and that's looking at electrification, which is kind of a big topic. But what kind of strategies are we seeing to electrify vehicles and buildings? And second to that, what's needed in terms of grid modernization to support these moves?
Yeah, this really is a twofold thing, and I'll try not to get too deep in the weeds here, but I think for time reasons, if nothing else, but you've got the need, I think, to electrify a lot of things, particularly transportation, vehicles, et cetera, buildings, building heating. A lot of buildings are still heated by fossil fuels, and industry to a point. Now we can debate exactly how much we can also achieve through getting people out of their cars altogether, for instance, as opposed to EVs. But realistically, to hit our targets, we're going to have to electrify an awful lot of things. I think on that side of it, you're seeing, in terms of electrifying things, you're seeing some pretty good stuff in these platforms. And you've seen some progress in recent years generally, although there could be more. Certainly, as I mentioned earlier, ZEV mandates and other policies to support transition to electric vehicles. They vary, but all the parties pretty much are committed to more infrastructure for charging. There's varying things on incentives. You really do, in addition to setting expectations, you really do need to try and help bring the cost of the upfront cost of an EV closer to a more traditional vehicle. And there's varying subsidies promised there. The Conservatives actually don't have any, which seems like a significant gap. The Liberals are promising extension of what they've done. The NDP is promising more than that, although with the whole Made in Canada feature that could be a little more challenging. But so there you're seeing some stuff. As I said, the Conservatives have a pretty good set of policies or promises, at least, around electrifying building heating and improving energy efficiency there. The Liberals are pursuing that as well. They all have at least some commitments on the industrial side, so that's pretty good. Where I think there is a lot more room, although there are some new policies for selection, and this is what I was writing about recently, is on meeting the electricity demand that we're going to see if we electrify everything. And if electrification is the backbone of our climate strategy, we are probably looking, most experts would say, at somewhere between 2 to 3 times the demand for electricity by 2050 that we have today. So right now, what you see from the parties, particularly the Liberals and the NDP, you'll see a lot of discussion of decarbonizing the existing grid, of a totally clean grid by 2030, 2035. And there are some pretty good policies around that. Although, when you've got, the Liberals have a proposed new tax credit for renewables. The NDP is proposing a climate bank, which sounds kind of like the existing infrastructure bank, but whatever, which would help fund some electricity grid projects. So there is stuff there. But a lot of it is just, let's get our grid completely decarbonized. But we're already most of the way there right now. Like, we have a very clean grid compared to most countries. Over 80% of electricity in this country is non-emitting. Whereas if you go to the US, it's like 60% is from fossil fuels. So we're doing well on that. The question is, how do you increase it? And again, there's some proposals there around stuff like renewables or energy storage, where there might be tax credits or supports. And the Liberals have a decent amount on that. The NDP has some, the Conservatives have some. But what I would like to see on this is a little more just engagement of Canadians in this challenge. Like, this is a big thing. And we have cause for pride in our very clean electricity right now. It is among the cleanest electricity in the world. It means we've got a bit of a head start on decarbonizing. It also means that we have an opportunity to attract a lot of clean industry, or industry that is increasingly concerned with being clean. So, if a company has a zero emissions commitment, it's certainly helpful if you can offer them zero emissions electricity. So building some awareness of that, but also of the challenge ahead and approaching it as a national challenge. We have a very fragmented system in this country where electricity policy is set by every province and there's not a lot of communication between them. But beyond just a few levers being pulled here and there, I'd like to see a little more on how do we bring all of this country together to tackle this challenge together, and what levers can the federal government use to do that?
Yeah, and kind of following up on that, just like how important is it that we get these provincial grids like actually talking to each other? Because right now it's like incredibly siloed, right?
Yeah, I think it's super important for a couple of reasons. One is you have to kind of break this into the macro and micro level a bit. And at the more, I'm getting wonky around this, but on the macro side, you've got the need to improve transmission between the provinces. There are provinces, if you look at a map of Canada, it's almost like alternating provinces that have an abundance of clean electricity right now, mostly through hydro, and provinces that don't. So, BC does, Alberta doesn't, and Saskatchewan is still on fossil fuel somewhat, but Manitoba has clean hydro, and Quebec obviously has a ton of hydro that it has the potential to export. And also those, the hydro dams can be used as energy storage, which can help encourage renewables. So there's a lot more room to build transmission lines between the provinces, but they've been pretty parochial with each other. So there hasn't been a lot of movement toward that. And the federal government does have currently a couple $2 billion through the infrastructure bank pledged toward that, but it needs to find a way to bring them together more, to get them to talk to each other more on that. And then on the more kind of micro level, all of these provinces are going to have to really experiment, and their electricity companies are going to have to really experiment with changing the way our grids function. Like, this is pretty exciting in a way when you think about it, in terms of, when we can all, or so many people can potentially get solar panels on their homes and sell the solar electricity back into the grid if we structure it properly. But there's all kinds of sort of decentralization of the grid to let consumers actually sell back into it, or achieve new savings on their own that involves new technology and new markets and all kinds of stuff. It's best if we don't have 10 provinces and 3 territories all doing that on their own. Like, they have to a point, because that's the way our federation is structured. But they should be sharing information and not running, each of them running their own pilot project where they don't know the other one's running it. Like, they should be really communicating with each other. And they need to find a way, I think the federal government needs to find a way to use its platform and its soapbox to bring them together. So there's a bit of that in the platforms. Like, the Liberals do have a promise to establish a pan-Canadian Clean Electricity Council, or whatever exactly they call it. So there's a bit of that, but I really think they're going to need to use their soapbox. And again, I think a campaign would be a nice time to build that narrative a bit of, we can work together on this and we have to do it. And I'd like to see more of that, even though you're starting to see a few of the policies being promoted within the platforms. So yeah. I think that probably is as much as we want to dive into electricity, if we're going to get to 3 other topics. So and also get to some questions from readers and or viewers and a couple other things. So let's move here to adaptation and climate resilience, which I think has been very top of mind this summer, as we've seen, particularly climate impacts in BC, although elsewhere as well. And Emma, you're obviously in BC, and you're a little closer to the ground in terms of what's happened there with wildfires and extreme heat and all of that. And what perspective has that given you on where we're at? As somebody whose home province is facing really severe consequences, what are you seeing here? Are we talking about this enough, and are we talking about the right things?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is really top of mind for a lot of British Columbians right now, certainly. And it's just been so, impossible to ignore this summer. And even the last few summers, we've spent, you finally get to those glorious dog days of August, and then you can't see the sun because the smoke is covering it. And, just huge amounts of BC's interior was, you're basically unable to travel there. It's a tourism region. Like, it's just completely a new normal of not being able to plan on being able to, safely breathe in the summer. And then on top of that, I think the town of Lytton, literally burning to the ground in a wildfire, in June. It wasn't even late in the season, like in late June, really, that made headlines around the world. It continues, I think, to kind of stick in people's brain as just a really dramatic consequence of that heat wave that, that town had also hit 50 degrees centigrade that day. And these just aren't temperatures that, we're used to seeing in Canada. So, that, and then the consequences that we saw in the ecosystem, as I mentioned earlier, like just, from the really micro level of like people's gardens just perishing, to the bigger level of, millions upon millions of shellfish just dying in conditions that, basically never been seen before. So, and then on top of that, you had we have drought in BC. You also have, major drought in Manitoba, where farmers are having to make really tough decisions about, even being able to feed their cattle at this point. So I do think in Western Canada, it's been a real summer of, with climate change very top of mind. And so I'm curious what, you've been seeing in the platforms in terms of what commitments we're seeing on the adaptation file.
I think there's some good movement on this. I mean, I think there's generally previously been a challenge of parties not wanting to talk about this, because it seems a little defeatist. You don't really want to talk about it. Everybody would much rather talk about mitigation, right? You'd much rather talk about how do we avoid climate change than how do we adapt to it. And for various reasons, parties don't want to talk about it. But I think they've been forced to a little bit. So what I'm seeing, there is some encouraging stuff. In the Liberal platform, there's, I think, $500 million for, I may be giving the number wrong, I think it's $500 million of new money to fight wildfires in BC. And there's sort of commitment from all parties to do something along those lines. They just have a number. There's, both the Liberals and Conservatives have quite a bit around flooding, which is a big issue, and in this part of the country, places which we don't talk about as much on climate impacts. Like we talk about the north or BC or coastal areas, but Windsor, Ontario has I think the greatest flood risk in the country, and we know that this is just entering the conversation. But I think on flooding, each of those parties has a commitment to introduce an insurance program for high risk households which can't get insurance at an affordable rate, which is going to be an increasing problem. So I think there's some positive movement on stuff like that. I have to say on this one, the NDP, I hate to keep harping on this, but there's not a lot there in their platform on it. There's sort of very broad strokes. They need to do it, but not as specific as those parties. I'm glad to see more talk about it. I still think there's a lot more, because the federal government, and this is, I guess, continuing. It's got darker, I think, here. This is a problem with being in a building at after 6 p.m. I have to go walk around. I'll wave my arm behind me. I'm sorry, I'm distracted now. No, the federal government is in the midst, and I guess still during the campaign, in bureaucracy, in putting together what's billed as Canada's first national adaptation strategy. And the framework for it is supposed to be end of this year, although we'll see what the election does to that. But I don't, and then the more specific strategy later next year. And so that's stuff you might see in the budget like 2023. I'm glad to see the parties with some more specific commitments in their platforms around this, because I don't think we can wait that long. Like yes, we need a strategy, but I don't think it can be 3 years from now to start making specific commitments. We need to start rolling that out now.
Yeah, as you were speaking, it reminded me of another kind of climate impact that we saw this summer, which was actually in Ontario. Lake Ontario hit its lowest water level since like the 60s. And, that there was a huge drought throughout that water system. And I believe, there were shipping issues in the St. Lawrence. And so, there's like really massive economic impacts. This isn't, just a matter of, the lake being a little bit lower. It's massive economic impacts. And, in BC, when our rivers are low, like, we have salmon that are literally struggling to get up the stream, and salmon are a huge part of like the cultural fabric of British Columbia and Indigenous communities, and also a huge part of the BC economy. So yeah, I think seeing more on that, and it's good to see that all, most of the parties at least address climate adaptation in their platforms this year. So moving along to our to our fourth thing.
Yes, I realized I should have walked around while you're doing that, so while you're talking there, so I get the lights back on. But I
No
hope you guys
worries.
can see okay. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, we can see you fine.
All
I
right,
think
fine.
it's okay. I
All
think
right.
we're all right. Yeah, so how are we seeing? I mean, this is kind of one of the hot topics that gets talked about a fair amount, but I think it's still hard to understand for folks. So we wanted to talk about it anyways. How are we seeing the different parties treating carbon pricing?
Yes, I'm going to do this one relatively quickly. If we're at least, I'll make my point quickly here because we have a more complex topic I think we want to get to before we're done. But I think I'm a little concerned right now that we're all a little tired of this discussion. It's been very prominent going back to like 2008 in federal election campaigns, and I think there's a perception that we've reached a consensus on this now because the Conservatives now have a carbon pricing proposal in their platform. But I really think we should stress here that there's very little more debate because their proposal is not the same as what exists right now. It may be similar on carbon pricing for very large industry, very large emitters, which have a specially designed system for them. They're open to keeping it in place with a bunch of caveats. So we'll see, it's uncertain. And that uncertainty alone is, sorry.
And the Conservatives also, like, they have this one proposal on their platform that I would put on my list of things that I don't like in the platforms, which is kind of interesting to talk about too, is this whole idea of the like low carbon savings account thing. So this just seems like, it just seems like kind of a crazy idea. So their idea is that like for individuals, when let's say you're, buying gas or whatever, instead of just like paying a carbon tax, which, goes into the whole kind of system of how we price things, you would get that money back on some kind of like debit card that you could then spend on green purchases. I just can't even imagine the bureaucracy in setting a system like that up, let alone the fact that that whole process kind of like defeats the purpose. The whole idea is that it's a carrot and a stick thing, right? So it's like you disincentivize the spending more money on carbon intensive things, but in this case, it's like you're going to get all that money back, but you can only spend on certain other things. I don't know. It just seems harebrained.
It's one of the most tortured, honestly, one of the most tortured policies that I've seen put forward in a campaign. It's obvious that they felt the need to have some kind of carbon pricing, but they didn't want to admit that they were going to do carbon pricing the way the Liberals do. So they came up with this. In addition to the other problems you mentioned, it's also regressive because the way the carbon price is structured now, we can debate the exact structure, but it does attempt to direct more money toward people toward lower income people. This would, it would in effect kind of in some ways reward the biggest users of energy because, which tend to be the richest people, because they would then, have these savings toward buying whatever things they wanted to buy. The bigger problem I have, though, aside from the construction of it, which I don't even know, to be honest, if they would actually follow through trying to implement this if they got elected. It seems like an incredible headache, as you said. But the concern there, too, which I think is more credible from them, is that they're talking about capping kind of restarting this and then capping the carbon price at $50 a ton instead of increasing it to $170 a ton, which is what the current Liberal government's plan is, and more or less supported by the NDP, I think. It's a valid choice. Like, you can definitely make an argument that carbon pricing is not the best, despite what many economists would say, that it's not the best way to go about this, and that you should emphasize other policies instead. But I think we have to understand that currently, carbon pricing is, if not the backbone of our national climate plan, our national emissions reduction strategy, it's pretty close to that. If you remove that, everything else has to be judged accordingly. You need more of everything else. So I think that's a real choice that we have to discuss. Do we want to remove that and replace other stuff? And are the Conservatives proposing enough to make up for it? And it's hard to say they are, even though they do have quite an ambitious platform. So I think we need to discuss this. And I think the fact that we've fought other campaigns in this country on this subject doesn't mean that we can say, well, this is all done now. It's not done. Like, this is a pretty big issue. And I hope that in the debates this week, they do touch on the subject a little bit because it's pretty consequential.
Yeah, I think there's a couple kind of key tells in the Conservative platform around this that just indicates to me it's kind of the difference between a philosophy of being a leader and being a follower. So, they talk about only implementing a carbon price if it, in line with other jurisdictions, for instance. And so it's like, we'll do it if they do it, as opposed to saying like, no, we're going to do this. They also have a line in their platform, which is like, a favorite line of the oil industry saying, Canada only accounts for 2% of the world's emissions. When I see that in a climate platform, it's a talking point from the oil industry that is meant to undermine the argument that we should do whatever we can do. And so that to me just like really kind of cuts to the credibility of the whole thing. So there we have it.
Yes,
Carbon pricing.
I'm with you entirely, and I'm being tired of that argument. I mean, we are per capita one of the highest emitters in the world, and the average Canadian doesn't have less responsibility than the average person in China just because they have a much larger country. I could go on about that. We didn't get yet, maybe we'll after, to the whole issue of carbon border adjustments, which are basically tariffs that all parties are now dabbling in as a way to be able to apply carbon pricing to industry here without hurting them competitively, which is a pretty interesting subject that also probably could use more debate. But I want to get us to the last of our 5 topics I think we're both eager to weigh in on. And it's very broad if we're talking about the future of industry in Canada and decarbonizing it, but particularly I think we need to focus a bit here on the resource sector. We are a country with a very large carbon footprint largely because of our oil and gas sector. It's obviously also pretty fundamental to our economy still. This is a debate that we so often step carefully around in this country for reasons that anybody watching this probably knows. The national unity sensitivities and so on. What are you seeing in this campaign? And maybe we can start a bit on the question of how willing governments are to even talk about the transition of that economy. I think neither of us likes, I don't think from chatting with you briefly, neither of us particularly likes the just transition term that gets thrown around, but there's certainly a need to figure out how to help people and places and economies that are reliant on fossil fuels move away from that. So what are you seeing?
I think this is another kind of telling part of the platforms that we're seeing. So in the Liberal platform, I believe we see like $2 billion towards I forget what they call it, energy futures fund, or like an energy transition fund, essentially to help workers transition. Meanwhile, in the Conservative platform, you don't actually see any acknowledgement that people are going to need to transition to new jobs. You actually see a section of their platform that's called Support for Western Canadian Jobs, which is where they've kind of hidden a lot of their really poor environmental policy, is kind of in this totally different section of the platform. I just think, we have to accept that an energy transition is going to be hard, and it's going to have real life impacts for real people. And if we don't address those things head on and create plans for that and create, opportunities for people to retrain and transition into new industries, then we're never going to get there. And so the fact that the Conservative platform doesn't really acknowledge that change is going to happen and that is going to require changes for real people on the ground, to me just indicates a little bit of a head in the sand approach to the whole issue.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because you can see there's so much separation if you look closely between the parties on this issue. And I think the issue of what gets described as fossil fuel subsidies are a good example of that, I think. And that can be a tricky discussion because it's really hard to classify what is or is not a fossil fuel subsidy. But the way they define it is interesting, and what they're willing to fund is interesting. And if you go, the Conservatives clearly are still willing to provide a decent number of supports to the oil and gas sector. There's no talk certainly of phasing out government supports for it. And there's positive talk about natural gas exports and so on. They're there. On the other side, you've got the NDP talking, and then the Greens talking about pretty unequivocally about ending fossil fuel subsidies entirely. And I interpret that based on what they're saying to mean that they want to not even provide funding to the oil and gas sector to attempt to green its operations through things like carbon capture and storage or hydrogen or other things that are being touted as ways to make that industry greener. The Liberals, I think, are in between the two, as often happens, where they're saying they're going to end subsidies. But my understanding is the ending of subsidies does not apply to things like carbon capture and utilization storage, which could help reduce emissions and probably would lead to emissions reductions, but also help that industry's competitiveness for some time. So there's a real mix there. And again, I'm not sure that this distinction is overly clear to too many people. But I mean, I'm curious what you make of, and if you've picked up much in this campaign so far on the carbon capture storage debate in particular, which to me is it's pretty front and center to this, because it really is. That is one of the main ways that the industry is talking about trying to save itself. The Alberta government, the Saskatchewan government are very bullish on it. And then again, as I said, there's sort of varying degrees of support. Is that something that you find resonates as an issue, or
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I see it coming up a lot as well, and it's certainly like touched on in most of the platforms. And it also actually came up as an audience question. So that's kind of a good segue to one of those audience questions actually, which was given the current state of carbon capture and storage technology in economics, what hope should we have in carbon capture and storage as a climate aid? I'm really curious for your thoughts on that one, Adam.
I think my view of it is that it's unavoidable to some extent. And I think you're seeing that from various studies. I mean, even certainly, the International Energy Agency, even the UN Climate Organization are starting to highlight it as necessary. You get into the question of what kind of carbon capture and utilization storage. So, there's two basic types of it broadly, very broadly. I'm oversimplifying it, but one is the type of technology that's more increasingly common, which is to capture emissions essentially on site from emitting companies, and the other is direct air capture, which can kind of pull carbon right out of the air. I don't think anybody can really object to the latter. And so long as it's scalable, and we can debate that, but I don't see a lot of I mean, if we're trying to reduce our global carbon footprint, pulling carbon out of the air seems like a pretty good way to do it. And there are Canadian companies, Carbon Engineering out of BC in particular, that's been a bit of a leader on that, and I think could probably use some more support in Canada for it. So I think that's that I have a hard time arguing with. On CCUS, on the on-site CCUS. I think, again, a lot of people in the space, including even from environmental groups that have concerns with this in general, would have some openness to doing it for some industries that are really hard to decarbonize, but aren't going to go away completely. So, steel, aluminum, concrete, fertilizer, all of those, again, it's hard to make too much of a case against to some extent. And then on oil and gas, I mean, I think a reasonable position, which is officially where the Liberals have landed, but there's nuance to it, is to allow or encourage some of it within that industry as it transitions, if you want to call it that, from fossil fuels, but not to use it to encourage enhanced oil recovery, which is basically pumping the captured carbon into the ground to make it easier to extract oil. Maybe somewhat more environmentally friendly, but it is going to lead to more oil extraction, which seems problematic. The Conservatives, I think, are supportive of that. They haven't really specified. The Liberals technically are against it, but there's a lot of room for nuance. There's a lot of pressure there. So I think we can do it in a way where we're recognizing industries are going to exist and we can decarbonize them somewhat. Great. I think if it's going to really prolong the life or the output of polluting industries, and as everybody likes to point out, oil and gas, like 80% of the emissions are in usage, not in the extraction or production, then I think it becomes more problematic.
Yeah, and I think that's where you see a lot of skepticism from people is around like the potential for carbon capture and storage to be used as kind of like a greenwashing technique, or for it to be, and I think I saw this language in the Conservative platform about it being like a key building block of the climate strategy. And can it be part of a strategy? I think yes, but it can't be the core building block of the strategy. The core building block of the strategy needs to be actually reducing emissions and protecting ecosystems. And it needs to be sort of like the last resort for those industries that are incredibly difficult to decarbonize, that we still need in some form. And so there can be a role for it, but it needs to be I think, you need to be able to trust that it's kind of going to come in the order and the place that it needs to come, as opposed to being kind of a pass for companies to continue to do the same old, same old.
Yeah, I think we have to be wary of taking false comfort from it, right? I mean, even outside the oil and gas sector, I mean, it may be great, it may be essential to saving the planet, but it doesn't negate the need to do everything else we talk about. It's one piece of it, and I think any time that you hear it invoked as, which I don't think you do too much, but anytime if you do hear it invoked during this campaign as, well, we can do this, we don't have to do X, I'd be very wary of that.
Yeah, totally. Okay, well, let's move to another audience question here. Where do the parties stand on the Trans Mountain Pipeline? I can take that question if you want. I can ask myself that question. So, the Liberals bought the Trans Mountain Pipeline and they still intend to finish building it. The Conservatives support that plan. They also want all the pipelines. In fact, they want to bring Enbridge Northern Gateway back from the dead by repealing the oil tanker ban on the north coast of British Columbia. They also talk about Trudeau not doing enough to salvage Keystone XL. So yeah, Conservatives want all the pipelines. And then the NDP and the Greens both say that they would cancel Trans Mountain. So that's a pretty quick answer on that one.
Great.
Okay, next question. And this has been discussed a lot in the chat too. What are your thoughts on the development and deployment of small modular nuclear reactors in Canada?
I think my short answer on this is that there's some promise to them, but they're, at this point, my understanding, I don't claim to be an expert in this, but my understanding is that they've yet to be proven to be an economical solution. So I think, I think it's worth investing some. My general view on all these things is it's worth investing in almost every possible climate solution, as long as it doesn't have an actively negative impact, because we're going to need things to work, and we have to take some chances, and not everything will work. So I would like to see more research flow into it and attempt to bring down the cost. I'm not, and I know that perspectives may be different on this in Western Canada or elsewhere. Growing up in Ontario, like I'm been living in Toronto. I mean, we're less than an hour from big nuclear reactors. It's nothing that in itself does not cause me great stress. It's kind of normal here. And so I don't have any sort of knee-jerk negative reaction on nuclear. I think the question is, can you do it, at an efficient cost? So again, experimentation, great. Maybe trying to work it into the blend, great. I wouldn't use it as a crutch to say we don't have to do X because of this, because it's unproven at this point. Do you have, what are your views on it? Are you more skeptical than I am?
No, I'd say pretty similar. Like, I think we're going to need all the solutions, but it's, it just hasn't really been done yet. So it's one of those things that's a little bit pie in the sky. We wrote a story on small modular nuclear reactors a while back earlier in the year. And, one of the things that we wrote about in there is how, they're largely being promoted as something that could work in remote settings, in remote communities to help communities get off diesel or at mines, for instance. But there isn't actually like a ton of appetite from like communities in the north, like putting their hand up saying like, yeah, I want like a nuclear reactor on my front porch. So, is it really going to come to pass? I kind of think that it's become a bit of one of those populist things where like, certain parties like, just really like to talk about it as like this kind of innovative solution, but we haven't really seen it proven yet. So I do have some skepticism about whether it will actually work and whether people will actually, whether there's actual social buy-in to that happening. For another question, what about, the parties are also talking about like turning Canada into a world leader in the manufacturing of electric vehicle batteries, basically. We have a question here from Allison about the pollution from mining the minerals for the batteries for electric cars and concerns about that. So I can just start with my 2 cents. Like, I had an interesting chat with Maren Smith from Clean Energy Canada about this last week. And, she was talking about how on the one hand, it's an interesting opportunity to kind of pressure the mining industry to actually clean up its act and be more responsible, because there are emerging standards for responsible mining around the world, especially for electric car vehicles, batteries, so, this could be something to kind of prod the industry to really come up with a certification system for what needs to be in place. My caution would be that, as of right now, like the mining industry, particularly out west here, doesn't have like a really great track record. We had a massive mine incident, the Mount Polley mine spill here in BC 7 years ago. That's, taxpayers paid hundreds of millions of dollars to clean up, polluted a salmon river. And so we haven't seen the type of regulation here. And I know that this is a big concern in Quebec too, that I think is going to really confidently have people cheering for Canada to be a world leader in providing the minerals for mining. So I think something would need to change for that to happen.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with those concerns. I guess I'd flip it around a bit and say, and I think you were sort of alluding to this too, that Canada should, not necessarily will, be able to be a lot better about these things than a lot of other countries in the world that are serving that supply chain. Also, there are all kinds of human rights issues in some of the countries that are supplying it. And I think there is an opportunity here for us to prove we can build a more green and more responsible supply chain to feed EVs. So I think there is potential there. I would say in terms of actually it happening, there are some interesting ideas. And you mentioned Maren Smith from Clean Energy Canada. I mean, this is a case where they did a pretty good report based on pulling together a lot of people from industry, environmental groups, and so on. And this is one where a bunch of the platform proposals looked basically pulled, especially the Liberal ones, looked almost pulled directly from that report, which is great, but it also suggests that I don't know how deeply any of the parties have really thought yet about how to build the supply chain. Every party will say, particularly Liberals and Conservatives, but every party will say, we have an opportunity from responsible mining through to refinement, through to parts manufacturing to assembly, and we're doing okay on the assembly part. Like there's some big commitments in the last couple of years, subsidized by government, but by Ford and to a less extent other automakers, especially Ford here in Ontario. There's also interesting stuff happening on electric buses, particularly in Quebec and some other provinces, particularly Quebec. So there's stuff happening on that end. I haven't really seen anybody prove yet that they can actually build the supply chain. And this is like a lot of these spaces, it's a very crowded space. If we're serious about this, and if, I think there's good reason to be, particularly if we're moving toward a ZEV mandate and so on, then it's going to require pretty comprehensive and aggressive moves. And they're not going to really have time for like 4 years of consultations. At the same time, they have to do it obviously in a way where they're not just, steamrolling over environmental regulation or scaling that back to compete internationally. So it's tricky, but I think it's worth the effort to a point.
Yeah, for sure. So we just have a few minutes left. So moving to kind of our last question, and this is every single person I talk to about the election raises this, and I say it's been raised many times today too. And it's really that gap between the campaign commitments and reality. And so we talk all this talk about kind of comparing election platforms, but at the end of the day, can any of the parties be taken seriously to deliver on their climate commitments?
You want me to start?
Yeah, you take that one first.
Okay, I'll take it first. I want to hear what you think about this too. I entirely get the cynicism on this, and I think it's partly warranted. Obviously, we have come nowhere close to hitting climate targets thus far, or even really significantly reducing our emissions. I would say, in fairness, in the last few years, the federal government, under the Liberals, has put in policies, carbon pricing being the most obvious one, but clean fuel standard, various industrial programs, a whole bunch of stuff that I think will undoubtedly reduce our emissions somewhat. I don't think it's happened yet. Increase in not immediate past years, but not too distant past from oil and gas. Gas sector has sort of negated any positive movement on this, but I don't see how we don't reduce our transportation emissions, or our building emissions, or industrial emissions. It's going to happen somewhat. So I wouldn't be totally cynical about it, or say, oh, none of this matters because we haven't done it that much so far. What I would say is when I look at these proposals, in terms of the ambition being matched by the ability to deliver. I mean, obviously, for reasons we've talked about, the NDP and the Greens, I don't think have the detailed policies in place to be able to really claim they've got a clear plan to get there. The Liberals and Conservatives, with somewhat more modest goals in those two parties, 40% from the Liberals in terms of emissions reductions, 30% from the Conservatives, they do have a lot more detail. What I wonder looking at those platforms is, can you do all of these things? Like, I've watched the government in recent years develop, say, the Clean Fuel Standard, which is about lowering the carbon intensity of some of the fuels we use. It was like years of consultations and bureaucratic wrangling and all of that. In the last election, the Liberals promised a just transition strategy for workers in the resource sector and to help move on from that sector in a constructive way. They didn't do anything on it until they launched consultation just before the election, because they're doing a lot of other stuff too. Like there's a lot on their plates. So to me, a big question, I don't know the right answer to this, but to me, a big question people should be asking themselves watching this is not just who has the best plans, although that's obviously an important question. It's which of these folks do I trust to give this the focus, the priority, to have the competence to pursue it, to have enough of their ministers on the same page to move in that direction, to push back against industry that objects to some stuff. Who's got that focus? Because you're going to have to do an awful lot of things at once to have any chance of meeting these goals. That's my take on it.
Yeah. I mean, I always like to push back on like the cynicism of this, although of course there is always a gap between what parties promise and what they deliver. I really love the quote that politicians campaign in poetry, but they govern in prose. They're just not the same thing. Yes, we're in the poetry phase right now where they're, promising the moon, and no party follows through exactly on their promises. And that can be really discouraging. But I think at the end of the day, there's still real differences between the parties. And there's real differences in terms of who you think you can trust. And, at the end of the day, you vote for a candidate in your riding. You don't vote for the prime minister. You don't, you need to really look at the candidates in your riding and look at the context where you live to assess who the best bet is. And, we'll be publishing a further explainer on this, breaking down all the positions, summarizing this 1 hour long chat, if you will, into something that you can kind of study up on as well. But yeah, at the end of the day, I think to help battle the cynicism, it's important to look close to home, check out your own candidates and make your decisions that way. So on that note, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. This has been a real pleasure. We're going to be dropping the links to both of our newsletters in the chat there if you want to follow our ongoing coverage about this. And Adam, it's been a delight. Very nice to meet you and do our first event together.
Yes, one day we'll meet in person. When we can travel again, someday we can chat about these things in person like people used to do. But this was great in the meanwhile.
Wonderful. Okay, thanks
Thank you
so
to
much,
everybody for tuning in too.
Okay, bye.